Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you here today. Today, Brother Wesley Walker will be our guest speaker. We've had sermon share here. We've been telling you about it for a couple of weeks. Had several area ministers here learning more from one another, working with the book of 1 Corinthians and talking with one another about how we came up with sermons that we did and trying to help encourage and build one another up. And Brother Wesley helped us through some of that as well. Brother Wesley and I met in Michigan where he came up to do a gospel meeting, and he and I have kept in contact throughout the years, and I'm blessed to be able to call him my friend, and I know that you will be blessed to be able to hear him. Brother Wes?
I do not remember the exact day. That time of my life, those days run together in ways that other times have not. But I remember the exact moment. I can picture it, walking into Baptist Hospital there in Nashville, Tennessee. My wife had been there that morning, and it was my turn to take my shift in the NICU. My son Emmett was somewhere around 30 to 45 days old. He was in the NICU his entire time and would spend another several months afterwards there as well. On day 2 of his life, Emmett had to go into a surgery, rushed there. We got a 7 a.m. call saying we need to take him now over to the next hospital down the street. Thankfully in Nashville there are plenty of options and places to go. He had surgery, and we thought there was a particular diagnosis that was taking place, and we were prepared for what they said would be a surgery that was minor, although any surgery happening to your 1-day-old son doesn't seem minor in anyone's eyes. But in the eyes of the surgeon, a minor surgery, he has done quite a bit. And then Emmett would spend some time in the NICU, and he would be back to normal. The surgeon did his surgery. He then met us in a small room in the waiting room. And the surgeon, like many surgeons I've met since then, was very good at what he did, which was cutting and putting things together and doing surgery, and very bad at being able to tell parents what the end result was in the end. The surgeon said, well, we finished up the surgery, and what I thought Emmett has, he does not have. Rather, I think he has cystic fibrosis, and he walked out of the room and left us there in a room to Google something we had never heard before. Now, if you have not done this, I would not ever recommend you Googling as your first introduction to any particular diagnosis you have, because that immediately tells you things you don't want to hear. So imagine my wife and I Googling this particular diagnosis, and 2 of us reading about days that they live, failure to thrive, average age limits, and all the things that go along with that. And then beginning to figure out from our family how this genetic condition we had heard nothing about was passed down, and understanding that the 2 family members that we had closest to us during that time were both born in the 1960s, and they both had children who died at the age of 2 or younger for failure to thrive. And we sat there in a room, not having met anybody who knew much about this particular disease, wondering what the future looked like for Emmett. About 30 days or so into that particular journey, we found ourselves back and forth in the NICU. I have 2 older girls than Emmett, and so being a parent to them, also taking care of Emmett, meant that I spent my morning with the girls and working, and my wife spent the afternoon and evening until they kicked us out of NICU with the girls, and I would go up there and see Emmett every day. So as long as we could be beside him, we were there, somebody, as many hours as they would let us stay in that spot. In this particular exchange, we had somebody watching the girls at our house, and I drove up there, and it had been a rough 30 days or so. We had not yet met the specialist at Vanderbilt University. We didn't know much about this condition, but we had been hearing from his various doctors there were some concerning things about Emmett beyond just simply this initial surgery. Specifically, his liver was not functioning properly, and we met with a Vanderbilt surgeon who has given us options for Emmett's future, and some of them were, we hope, and you don't like to hear that we can make this work so that he can get big enough that he can have a liver transplant at the age of 2. My faith in God had become stricken. I had been reading Habakkuk more and more because I couldn't quite figure out why this was happening. But on this particular day, I walk up there, and my wife had a sense of calm about her that was unique to me because I had not been calm the entire time, and somewhat unique to her. And so I think for some reason I asked her, what's different today? She stepped back for a moment. She said, for some reason this morning I was thinking about Emmett and life and the faith we have and sort of what happens beyond this life. And she stepped back and was thinking to herself, and she said, now again, things have changed the last 8 years of Emmett's life, but at this moment in time, she said, we know most likely why or the cause of Emmett's death will be. And I thought, we've been kind of dealing with that for a while now, and we know that there will be a day when he won't be with us. And then she said, but I also know all of us will have a day we won't be with us. And I was thinking about, in her mind, I was thinking about heaven today, and about what that's going to be like for not just Emmett, but anybody, to see him without being, at that time, he had been hooked up to something his entire existence. We had held him through either incubators and eventually held him with tubes tied to him and all this stuff that goes on. But Emmett, without those things, without having to worry about the future of what cystic fibrosis would do, without having to check lung functions and everything else, and we would just see our boy be a normal boy. That was her mind in that moment. In that brief moment in time, faith to her had a greater meaning than it had before, because she was able to connect this experience we had in life to something further down the road that she believed would happen, and said, I can handle this moment in time, this tragedy in time, because I know there's something greater happening when this life is over. You know, it's interesting when you have stories, and maybe you've seen stories of hikers or folks who are lost for a long period of time, or for what seems to be a pretty long period of time for the circumstance, and they're asked, how exactly did you maintain this? How did you get through this? And they will oftentimes mention they had faith in God or faith in someone else. They had this motivation that if I can just make another day, another minute, another hour, that someone will find me, that God will be on there for me. They had this idea of faith being a huge motivator to help them in that moment in time sustain the next day, the next minute, the next hour. And they, at the end of that, would talk about their faith. I live in Tennessee. In Tennessee, there is a religion that we practice on Saturday called college football, and we watch that all the time there. In fact, I do have the Vol shirt on today for those who want to witness it. Now, I remember watching college football a few weeks ago. There was a national championship game. There are a couple of Buckeye fans I've met already here in which Notre Dame and Ohio State played. Leading up to the national championship game, they interviewed players. We're not going to get into a theological discussion if God cared which team won that game or not, but they interviewed players about their particular motivation and what carried them to that game. And almost every one of them, at some moment in time, mentioned their faith in God. And after the losses, they interviewed coaches, which is always a difficult interview. And the coach for Notre Dame was asked about this particular loss. He had made his team to a national championship. They had lost the game. And he was asked about why exactly he can make it through this. And he made, again, a point about the idea of the faith that he had helping him during this moment in time. In fact, go through the annals of human history and lay out great accomplishments by various folks and various people, and you'll find over and over again they credit what they were able to do based off a faith that they had in something greater than themselves, and for much of the Western world, a faith that they had in a God who created the universe and led them to explore, to go out, to try new things, to push the limits of what was before. We have this sense of faith as being something that just works. Not in the sense of faith has us go and do stuff, a James chapter 2 type thing, but faith in the sense that it appears that humans might have been created as individuals who need faith, who need something greater than ourselves to push us along and see us through life. You know, typically a why faith sermon is a old school apologetic sermon, which is the idea of we're going to go through and talk about existence for God, and we might give you various arguments for his existence, and we'll lay out principles and this thing and that thing, or we might go through and show the history of the Bible, whatever it might be. And there are places for that in sermons, and I'm sure there are people here who are experts in that particular area. But for me, I want to talk about why faith, not in the sense of let me give you 4 reasons to believe in God, or 3 reasons why the Bible is true, or why you can believe this or that, but why faith in the sense of why you should consider faith, because faith works in the world that we live in. That God has designed us in such a way that as creatures we need something greater than ourselves to believe in just to get through life. There's research that shows that individuals who are dealing with medical diagnosis. I work in the medical field and medical technology, and we have all sorts of things that we do to help diagnose patients. And we can lay out and say this patient has this issue and that problem, and we can bill that patient based off of this treatment and that treatment and this treatment, and we can say if they follow this procedure and this plan, they should get better. There's research that says there are times that two patients who have the same diagnosis, the same issues, the same thing, and one of them seems to have a reason to live or has a deeper faith, seems to thrive better than those that don't. One of my close friends is a funeral director, and he talks about how January is one of the months of the year where they see an uptick in deaths. So I asked him one time, why is that? And this is not a scientific research, but he says a lot of times you have, by January, you have folks who have sort of waited for, had faith in, wanted that next day, and they had something to look forward to, and so they're waiting for Thanksgiving or Christmas with family to have that final one, and then once that's completed, they had sort of decided now is a good time as ever to give up the fight. But that moment in time before that, they had a faith, a idea of something's greater ahead of me. Let me just get to Thanksgiving, to Christmas. Or you mentioned the fact you'll find folks at the weddings of a child or a grandchild that will wait until afterwards, and you can tell they sort of say, okay, I made it to that moment in time. I'm ready for what lays ahead of me in the world to come. And his point was there seems to be a point where this faith sustains them. This greater thing ahead of them moves them forward even further. And whether that faith is in, the future of an expectation of getting to see a granddaughter walk down the aisle or getting to see one more Christmas with family, or for us that are Christians, that faith is the idea of a world to come and a trust in God to get us there. We know when we step back that faith in humans has infinite value. I want to talk today about maybe some of you who don't have faith, why you should consider it. Maybe some of you who do have a trust in God, on why that trust in God helps us and motivates us and sees it through us. I've been 8 years with Emmett. I'm going to go ahead and tell the end of the story. Not the end of the story. He's got a long way to go. But I'll tell you the good news part of the story at this point. He's 8 years old. Emmett yesterday was going to come with me to Arizona. He's a big baseball fan. We're going to go to a spring training game, except for the fact he plays for a local team, and that local team had a tournament yesterday, and he played in yesterday. And if you saw Emmett run around here, you would see no difference between him and the other eight-year-old around. He has extra treatments and extra time that he takes and extra stuff he has to do. And we monitor certain things and sickness levels around him. But for the most part, he's living a great life. And my wife, who immediately at first was worried about when we lose him, is now thinking again about future in those areas. Why faith? I want to spend some time brief. This is not going to be a long, drawn-out, every reason for faith, because you could go through and spend a lot of time thinking of all of these. But there are three big things I want to share with you on why it is that we should be a people that think back and think why faith's important or what faith benefits us. Because sometimes in our world in which we have so much sin and so much chaos and so many things happening, we might step back and say, that does trusting in God even matter anymore? Look at what's happening all around me. Or maybe in our life, some personal things that hit us, and we begin to wonder to ourselves, does trust in God make sense in my life? Look at my life circumstances. Why should I be faithful? Or why should I have a trust in God? Or why should I be somebody who believes in the God of the Bible? I'll give you 3 points today, and I hope these are helpful to you. One is why faith matters, because faith sustains us. You oftentimes compare faith to food. What I mean by that is we want to have these moments in faith to where we step back and we have these times in our life where we can say, look how faith saw us through this moment. And there are times in life that faith absolutely does that. That day in the hospital room, sitting next to my wife and her giving me that was a time in which her faith was seeing her through a difficult situation. There have been times where I've sat next to a husband or a wife who's about to lose their husband or wife in that moment in time, and you can see them leaning on the faith that they have in God in that moment. As Emmett went through his first 6 months of life, some liver issues, the things that went along with that, I would go into the room, the NICU room, and eventually his room at our house, and I would sing the song, He's Sweet I Know, a song that I grew up singing about Jesus and his nature. And I would quote to myself the book of Habakkuk that said, yet will I trust him. Not understanding the nature of God, but I'll trust him anyways. And there are times I can look back and say, that simple song of trust in Jesus, that simple verse sustained me through life's difficult times. Or somebody has a diagnosis in which they find themselves close to what they think's the end, and faith helps them see a future. Buddy Jones at Woodson Chapel is a 89-year-old man who's been at Woodson Chapel for 57 years. He's still actively involved. He was given a cancer diagnosis that had a terminal timeline. In the last few weeks, he's still there every week. He's still interacting. You can see that he's slowed down. In fact, he broke his hip a couple months ago, but he's still showing up and doing it, and he's still doing the work he's always done, and that faith is sustaining him to the next moment in time, the next place in time. So yes, there are times, big picture, that faith sustained us in powerful ways. Just like in your life, there are times you remember certain meals, right? It might have been a special occasion with your husband or wife when you went somewhere and you had a meal like you've never had before. Maybe you dressed up and you went along your way and you enjoyed that together. And one of my special meals in my life was I took my then 10-year-old with me to New York City for work. A funny story, before I went with her, she told me, "Dad, you are 99% cool." And I thought, okay, she's a preteen. Being 99% cool is pretty awesome. But I was in the back of my mind, I was going, where's the 1% at? Until she went and said, "Dad, do you mind if I look at what you're packing to wear in New York City?" And I thought, there's the 1%. How I dress is the spot where she's saying your coolness factor is way down. But I took my daughter to New York, and we ate at just a regular New York pizza spot. But being there with her in New York for the first time made that one of those greatest meals in your life type moments, having that chance to do that. If I could go back 30 years ago to 7-year-old Wesley at my granny's house, who passed away when I was 12, and get on a Saturday morning when you had cartoons only on Saturday morning, and you'd wake up early and my granny would make the greatest gourmet breakfast in the entire world. Toast with crunchy peanut butter on top. And I would eat that breakfast there, and that is a memory I always have with her, that's what she gave me, along with what I call Granny's coffee, which is this much milk, a lot of sugar, and just enough coffee to warm the milk up on that Saturday morning. That's a meal that I remember forever. Maybe you have a few of those in your life, those meals that you remember. But a lot of your meals in your life aren't like that, are they? But the day in and day out, what are we going to eat? I've got 3 kids. I work a couple of jobs. My wife works. There are nights when we get home and we think, what's in the pantry? What can we make? What's quick? And what can we just make sure every kid is fed before they shower and go to bed? Those are those meals that sustain us. And sometimes faith is like that. It's not these grand moments of look what God did, but just everyday life where God shows up and continues to be there. Reminds me of the book of 1 Kings where Elijah has kind of back-to-back moments. Moment number 1 is that Mount Carmel moment. Remember Elijah and all the gods, all the prophets and priests of Baal, and Elijah has this set up in terms of the big altar, and the prophets and priests of Baal, they sing and dance and cut themselves and say, bring down fire, and nothing happens, and Elijah just simply says a small prayer. And fire comes down from heaven and takes off the altar, and there's that moment. Faith, right? One of those times in the Bible you wish you could be there. In the next chapter, you find Elijah in a cave, scared to death of Jezebel, and asking God, "Where are you?" And God tells Elijah, "I'm not always in the whirlwind. I'm not always in the Mount Carmel. And sometimes, Elijah, I'm that still, small wind that's just there." You might not see the greatness of God at a particular moment, or your trust might not be there. But the truth of the matter is you can step back and understand that God sustains us through and throughout life. If Daniel were talking about this woodpecker, I would have my sermon like Jesus is knocking, or do you hear the knock of your heart? Something of that nature. At least bring this in to place here. He knows when you're speaking. I think maybe he's trying to respond to the invitation right now, and he's trying to get through at this moment in time. So I want you to see why faith is a sustaining moment. And faith makes it to where even life's normal things have greater meaning. Book of Ecclesiastes, there you have kind of 2 worldviews at play. The first worldview is something like this. You got a situation to where if there is nothing but what you see, there's no God, there's no future, there's nothing to put your trust in, then life is pretty bleak. What happens? You make money, you die, and somebody else gets it. You plan the future and you build the house and somebody else takes it away from you. You have the moment of pleasure and it's gone and you wish you could go back to that day and time. It kind of lays out this sort of nihilistic idea of like, if all there is the day-to-day life, then it really is terrible because you just sort of live, you die, and no one remembers you ever again. But he flips the script and says, but if there's a life where there's a God who you put trust in, then all of life begins to have meaning. to all of a sudden a simple meal around a table with people you care about is elevated. And that's what faith does on a regular basis. It makes life meaningful. Where I can go back and have a bowl of beans and cornbread, which was our poor folk West Tennessee meal, that as an 8-year-old I thought was the dinner of kings, but really was my mom trying to feed us when that's all we had in the pantry and all we could afford to eat. And that meal becomes something special because we all had a trust in something greater than ourselves. You see, faith sustains us. Why faith? Because faith just gets us through life. You maybe have said this before. I don't think I could have gotten through that without trusting in God. Or to put it negatively, I don't know how people handle these situations without belief in God. And the idea behind both of those is the same truth. Faith is a sustaining thing. But secondly, though, faith is something that motivates us. Hebrews chapter 11, you have that in your Bibles there. You just read chapter 12, but you go back one chapter, and in chapter 11, verse 1, you have a very famous sort of definition of faith. It's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not yet seen. Now, that's a weird way of saying something very plainly that means this. Faith is living as if the promises of God are true. Now, the Hebrew writer, he's kind of known for some clunky phrasing, is trying to get across to us that if you truly have faith, you live right now in this moment as if you're convinced every promise that God has made is going to happen. And that motivates you to live differently. That faith's a motivator to go and try something different. If you don't believe me, look at the next few verses there in Hebrews, right? Hebrews 11, what's the common phrase? By what? By faith, and then by faith again. If you missed it, by faith again. And in case you didn't get the point, he's going to say by faith over and over and over again to remind us that the great acts of God and the great acts of the people of God were all motivated by a simple idea, and that is they believed in the promises of God. What's beautiful about Hebrews chapter 11, though, is so often those promises were things they had not had evidence before of seeing. Noah's asked to build an ark, and we're not sure if Noah has seen a flood in his entire life. He's asked to build a gigantic boat that's huge and almost monstrosity that's meant to almost be funny when someone walks around and sees a big old boat on dry land. I'm sure you guys get rain. I've not seen much moisture out here, but I'm sure you get rain. But if someone out here said, I'm going to build the biggest boat in the world in the desert because there's going to be a flood that covers everything, in today's world we go out there and say, that person is crazy. That would be our mindset. Well, Noah's building this great thing based off a flood who we've not has ever seen flood waters, and here he is building it because he trusts in God. Or Abraham, we're told, goes up to the mountain there, willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, the son of promise, the one that God said, yes, this will keep your promise, who has no descendants. And so it would stop the whole promise of Abraham to have this great many descendants. And he goes up to sacrifice him at the command of God. But the text of Hebrews says, Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead. Had Abraham seen a resurrection his entire life? No, he hadn't, but he knew the promise of God was Isaac would be the child of promise. So he reasoned in his mind, if I believe in the promises of God, God will raise this boy from the dead if I kill him up here, if I sacrifice him to God. By faith, these things happen. By faith, Rahab put her neck on the line for the Israelite army and said, and hid those particular folks, not willing to give her a death sentence on her behalf. By faith, individuals face various difficulties and struggles and pains. All of that happened by faith. Faith motivates us. There's a parable that we have in the New Testament where Jesus talks about preparation for his return. And part of that parable and preparation is how do you use the gifts and talents that you've been given? It's actually the word talents is in there, but it's not the word for talents is a money term, but it does apply pretty clearly to what has God given us to use. And there's kind of three folks here. They make up two categories. The first two are folks who have gifts and talents and say, I'm going to go use them in service to God. They're motivated to go do something. The last group was a man who said, well, I got these talents, but I don't want God to be upset with me, so I'm going to bury it deep in the ground. Which one of those groups was blessed by God? The one who are motivated to go out there and do something. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you have an entire chapter dedicated to the fact that one day there is a resurrection of the dead, which is a key Christian principle that gives us motivation. It's what fueled my wife in that hospital room to say, yep, Emmett might pass long before we want him to, but the truth of the matter is a lot of folks pass before we want them to, or they pass, period. And if we believe in the resurrection, we're going to end up in a world to come that's better than this world. And so Paul hammers the Corinthians saying, how in the world can you not believe in the resurrection? It's the very essence of our faith. And then in verse 58, he tells those who will hear that believe in the resurrection should lead to what? Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. A reminder there that faith motivates us. It challenges us to see beyond our everyday life and the circumstances we have in front of us. I live probably a similar life that you live, in that life has a way of just keeping you so busy, you don't think about stuff beyond the next moment. My wife updates our Google Calendar, and I get to go look on my phone and see all kinds of color coding for various activities. And then I get to annoy her by email or texting her and saying, what do we have tonight? And she says, look at the calendar. And I say, great. If you looked at it, can you tell me what we have tonight? And she doesn't find that near as funny as I do in those back and forth communications there. There can be a consistent, what's the next thing in front of us that we miss what's bigger. And faith reminds us of what's bigger out there. So hopefully we are motivated to live a bigger life than what's my next spot to drop a kid off at? Or when are we going to eat between now and tonight to make these things work? And what has to have what, and who's going to what thing, and where am I traveling, and where are you traveling, and what are we doing? Faith motivates us to live a bigger life than that because we believe in a God who has in store for us something bigger than that. And not just that, we believe in taking the risk in life because we know that the world to come will be worth it. And so we are steadfast and we will always abounding. And finally this, why faith? Because faith changes us. In both an individual sense but a collective sense, what people believe matters. Step back and think about nations across the world that we have today. And think about the dominant religion of specific nations, and then put those side by side and ask yourself the differences that you see. Think about what happened a few years ago. Well, I don't want to get political on Afghanistan, but a few years ago we pulled out of Afghanistan. When the United States left with sort of our views of idea that women should be educated and they could be involved in the way of life, and there was an inherent value in them, there were individuals and girls in Afghanistan going to school, and they were going to different careers, and they were serving in different ways. One of the saddest pictures I saw was about 6 months ago, a group of women who were training to be doctors in Afghanistan with the goal of treating other women, not treating men, but treating other women. We're told they could not finish up their degrees by the Taliban, who because of their faith felt it was inappropriate for a woman to study in that way. Faith changes societies. What people believe matters in the very collective level of how exactly do we care about things. And even in our own countries, we think about changes that are made and things that are done. Some of that comes to the fact of what do we believe today that we didn't believe 50 years ago, and vice versa. Those things change the history of the world. In fact, so much of the stuff that we take for granted today is because of the influence of the Christian faith for thousands of years on what we call the Western world. We have outside of us a Banner Hospital. I know them because they're one of the groups that I work with. There's a lot of those around here. Hospitals were created and serve all levels of community because Christians felt everybody deserved care. You think the idea of educational programs in which girls and boys can go get educated, whether you're rich or poor, you're nobility, you're a peasant, all that came about because the influence of faith that everybody deserved the chance to learn and to grow. Those are Christian ideas that pop up and have changed human history. The idea that young children are valued in society, that those who are of a different ethnic group or nation or status are valued, those are all Christian ideals that came about that showed how faith changes things over time. Faith changes us. And so there's this idea that faith matters because with faith, all of a sudden people live up to new and different ideas. The Christian idea of humility and others above yourself was not seen in a Roman world when it came into it. There was none of this concept of making sure that you took care of the weak and the sick and those who might not have special status or privilege. In fact, those lesser than you were used as objects for your own pleasure or for your own desires or for your own benefit in that world. But yet Christianity comes in and says, no, we're created in the image of God and all of us are viewed in that way. That's how faith changes societies. But also faith changes us individually. C.S. Lewis was a 1950s apologetic individual, and he was asked a question about one of the age-old questions of, Christianity seems great, but a lot of Christians do bad things. They have tempers, and some of them do this, and they do this thing. And it's one that stuck home with me where he said, your comparison is wrong. And the interviewer said, what do you mean? He said, well, what you're saying is the Christian ideal is that someone shouldn't lose their temper. What I want you to know is, what if that person did not have faith? What if they didn't believe in God? What if they weren't working to be restrained by the Spirit of God to control their temper? How bad would that person be? And his point was, all we can say is what we see today. We don't know how far that person has gone and how much they have changed in their lifetime from point A to point B because of what faith did for them individually, their trust in God. My parents became Christians when I was later on in life. All the little kid stories, I missed those because I started going to church when I was 11. My mom one day with 3 boys decided the best time to go to church when you have 3 little boys and see what happens. And she rolled the dice, went to a 30-member church there in West Tennessee, and she had a lady there who sat by her. And that lady, simply by sitting by a mom of 3 boys who's going to church by herself, is the reason why I'm preaching, my brother's preaching, my other brother works in a youth ministry role in another spot, because this lady said, hey, there's a mom here, let's go sit beside her. Might be some stories for some of you all to think about what you can do to help out. But that little idea of I'm going to do this changed my mom's life, eventually led to my dad, who wanted to argue with my mom about religion to eventually become a Christian. And my dad, who before that time lived a life that would not be characterized with the Christian conduct that we see today, went on to become a Christian and begin a missionary work in South Dakota, and for 17 years planted churches there. Because faith changed, See, faith has that ability to change us, to make us different than we were before, to help us be the people that God wants us to be. Why faith? You'll get somebody who might, on a television show this afternoon, some preacher might say, have faith because you're guaranteed to be wealthy and not have any sickness, and everything will go perfect. You have a big smile on your face, and I'm here to tell you, I'm somebody who's tried to have a faith in God, and that's not how life always works. Yes, there are great things, and God is good all the time, even in the midst of difficult times. He's still good. I don't always see the goodness. I don't always figure it out why these things happen, but I trust him anyways. But faith has a way of sustaining us, of saying, yes, every day, whether it's a James chapter 1, count it all joy and you face various trials, or it's eating a meal with a healthy family around the table, every day sustains us with faith. It motivates us to say, if I can do things by faith, my trust in God leads me to say, what can I do to serve others, to use my gifts, to use my talents, to be steadfast, immovable. And faith helps me become a better person than I am today. Because faith tells you to become like Jesus every single day. Why faith? I could list off 1,000 apologetic reasons, and we could have fancy words and pamphlets that we pass around and say that's why we believe from a scientific standpoint, but that's not why most of us believe. I'll make this point very clear. Many of you today are not Christians because someone came about and gave you a great scientific argument. You're Christians because you looked at faith and its benefits and you realized this just works. I think that's how God has created us, to be a people who trust. To be a people because of our faith can say whether the life's the filet mignon moment where God is blessing us or it's crunchy peanut butter toast with warm milk and sugar, that God is in all of that. And God is there. Jesus gives us benefits when it comes to faith. It's okay for us to step back and realize that faith can help us. It's motivated great human achievements. It's motivated individual changes that led to ripples that have had great changes in the world around us. And every day it gets us keep on going and handle whatever might come in front of us. That's why I believe, and that's why I hope you will as well. Jesus came along to show us a better way, to show us who the God that we trust in is really like. And the God that we trust in is someone who humbled himself to go to a cross and conquer sin and death on our behalf. So if you believe in that Jesus and you're ready today to respond to him in some public way, I'm assuming the tradition, Daniel, is come to the front row. Is that how we do it here? You can come to the front row and somebody, myself or someone, will talk to you and help you. We're going to be baptized into Christ. There's not a lot of water in Arizona, but there's probably some water in the building here. We can figure out a way to make that happen. If you want to turn your life over to God in some way, or if you need some help with your faith, maybe the church to help sustain you, motivate you, and be a partner with you as you change for God, I want to use this opportunity to do so. But for all of us, I hope we have a deeper appreciation for what trusting in God can do. Because whether it's the hard, difficult things in life or it's the everyday life journey, faith matters. And faith sustains us, motivates us, and changes us. And we can help you in your walk with God, your walk of faith. You can come to the front rows together. We stand and sing.